We're going to move now to Bryan Walsh, who was meant to be with us in person, but unfortunately was held back by pandemic-related reasons. So he's now coming up to us, I think, from home, at least somewhere in the US. Bryan is the editor of Vox's Future Perfect section, which is dedicated to covering the best strategies in policy, technology and philanthropy that can help us make the future a better destination. He also wrote a book in 2019 called End Times, A Brief Guide to the End of the World, another one to add to your catastrophic risk bookcase if it's not already there. Hi, Bryan. Good afternoon.
Hello.
Where you are.
Hi.
This is Jess from CSCCR. Thanks for joining us, and I'm sorry you couldn't be here in person. I'll hand over to you. Okay. I'll hand over to you to speak for a while. I'll be watching the questions on Discord and then pass some on to you as well as some in the room once you're done. Go ahead.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I'm very sorry. Obviously, I can't be there in person. As you know, I tested positive for COVID shortly before I was due to fly to the UK for this conference. And, you know, my symptoms have been very mild, but I'm very glad I caught it in time because I really would not have wanted to be the person who accidentally started a COVID outbreak at a conference on catastrophic risks. A little bit about me. Have you seen that? Sorry. A little about me. So I'm the editor-in-chief of Vox's Future Perfect. I've been a reporter and editor for more than 20 years with stints at Time, at Axios, at Medium. I've covered international news, climate change, technology, public health. As you noted, I'm the author of End Times, A Brief Guide to the End of the World. And unlike most of the speakers of this conference, I do not have a PhD, but I have once wrestled a Burmese python in Florida while reporting a story on invasive species. So, as I said, I'm the editor of Vox's Future Perfect section. My beat, more or less, is the end of the world. That's a major challenge because to work in the media is to focus on the here and now and whatever problem seize the public's attention in the moment. Sometimes that's important. More often, it's really not in any lasting way. But covering catastrophic or even existential risks means endeavoring to really try to divert the public's attention to disasters that would have a high consequence, but a very low likelihood in any given year of occurring, whether or not we do anything about them. And that's a really major mismatch for how much of the media does this work, really. So, you know, what you'd see here basically is imagine a basic graph. Like you have an X-Y axis, a Y axis. On one end, you have consequence. On one end, you have likelihood. So high consequence, low likelihood, that would be your catastrophic risk, the things you're talking about here, your out of control AI, your human-made global pandemic, your comet, et cetera. And then on the other side, you have what we in the media are covering on any given day. You have legislative hearings, you have presidential speeches, you have jobs reports, you have celebrity feuds, just about anything to do with sport. And that's high likelihood, but very low consequence. And that's not just the fluff that might fill the internet on any given day, but it's really what many of us would even think of as hard news. But that's kind of where we're at here. And too often, you know, when the media reports on existential risk, it kind of looks like, oh, here's your major story about a nuclear bomb that might stop a giant asteroid headed to the Earth, you know, in 6 months. Or it might be, here's an eruption at Yellowstone supervolcano that will plunge the Earth into darkness in just a few decades. Or of course, there's a picture of Arnold Schwarzenegger as the Terminator. Here's your fear about AI. And trust me, all these stories I've just taken have been from the Daily Mail, which by sheer amount of content, if not exactly quality, really covers more of existential risks than almost any other outlet. The result really is a kind of paralysis or avoidance. So, you know, pressed to cover existential risk, we often fall back on sensation or science fiction. We have headlines that might grab eyeballs for a few seconds, but really not much more, which has the purpose, I think, of making these risks both things that are unlikely and unknown, the stuff of the cosmos or of human error, so fantastical, the audience is either left paralyzed in fear or simply ignores the story altogether. Either way, we kind of end up often in the same place, doing nothing to protect ourselves and our future. Now, I've experienced this throughout my journalistic career, which time and time again has really intersected with the subject of catastrophic and existential risk. You know, it started for me about 20 years ago in Hong Kong, where I was working as a very young reporter. You might remember that was, of course, the SARS outbreak. And that was the time when you could see people wearing masks. You'd fear about an outbreak spreading. It was at the time it was killing nearly 10% of those who were being affected by it. I was a young reporter at Time Asia magazine. That was the Asian edition of Time back when that was a thing. that actually existed. And, at this point, I spent the first couple of years of my career kind of searching for any kind of subject. I was writing about Asian film. I was writing about Chinese literature. I was honestly writing a profile of sex toy manufacturers in Wenzhou, China. But when SARS came to Hong Kong in the spring of 2003, I'd really known that I'd found my subject. And I spent the next few months covering the outbreak, both following the scientists who discovered the virus behind SARS, watching the caseloads rise, and then almost quickly as it arrived, fall. And when that fell, so did the attention on the outbreak and that broader risk of pandemics. And what I would be showing you right now would be Google Trends search data on SARS basically would be flat, slight spike in 2020 and people searching for SARS-CoV-2. But really, as that outbreak went away, so did the threat of infectious diseases and so did the attention the public was putting towards it. And that cycle would recur in my career and others who cover this. So, in 2005, I began to work on avian influenza. You might remember that from that time period. I spent days going through backyard chicken farms in Indonesia. I was talking to virologists in Hong Kong and the US. I was tracking down some of the patients who were infected with this highly deadly, but ultimately, thankfully, not very transmissible virus. That was also a very, very big deal until really it wasn't. And again, you'd be seeing Google Trends data. You have a spike in 2005, around the time there was a lot of attention being put in it, and then just a flat line all the way almost until 2020, when again, COVID began to really recur in interest in the subject. And then, we can move on to Ebola. That was a major story in 2014, so much so that where I was working at the time, Time magazine decided to make the Ebola fighters the person of the year that year. It was a really major story. It was rich with human interest and dread. And it marked one of the few times the US government said to get serious about pandemic prevention. It allocated $5.4 billion for infectious disease response funding. But then, of course, again, the outbreak falls away, gets snuffed out, not much spread occurs in the US. And you can imagine what happened next. Public attention goes away. And with it, really, so does the interest in trying to prepare the US and the world more broadly for major pandemics. We get to something like pandemic prevention. Now, I wrote a cover story actually for Time magazine, big print warning, we are not ready for the next pandemic. That was in 2017. Guess what? Obviously, we were not ready for the next pandemic. And of course, that was a hard story to get in because it's really difficult for the media, I think, to prepare to write about things that haven't happened yet. It's tough to get attention from editors, tough to get attention from audiences. And of course, when COVID came around, that cover started popping up again. But that interest had almost disappeared until we got to, of course, COVID. And even here with pandemics, you would see interest at just a small spike around 2009 with the H1N1 flu pandemic. And then again, flat all the way up into COVID. We were left completely unprepared. And the media really wasn't doing its job. But to a large extent, that was also a part of the fact that the public was not paying attention to this either. And that gets us back to that issue that it just is very hard to report on these subjects when they haven't happened yet, when you don't really have clear, definable contact to look for it. And I have one last thing here. I would be showing you a Google Trends graph on existential risk. You see some spikes, and of course, the biggest spike is actually in 2012. You might remember nothing particularly happened that year that put humanity more or less at risk than it was before. But of course, there was intense interest in the supposed Mayan prophecies that the world would end in 2012. Fortunately, as far as I can tell, it hasn't. One thing that's interesting here is that there's an exception to this rule when we're talking about existential threats around sustained public attention. That's climate change, actually. Again, we've seen growing interest in that. You would see here as well, the Google Trends graph, where you'd see a sort of a rough upward slide in interest in this. It's not something like these other risks where it kind of rises when there's a disaster, then falls away. You've seen that grow and grow. And in many ways, that's because climate change has become kind of a background topic. It's something like unemployment, the stock market, political news. It's still a function of a news cycle. It tends to spike up during elections when the subject might be on the ballot, or during natural disasters when you can tie at least some of that to the effects of climate change. But it's really garnered interest, not because it's seen as a future threat, like so many other existential risks, because it's seen as something that's happening here and now. And that really makes the stuff of politics the stuff of news and sort of sets it aside from what we really are accustomed to when we're thinking about existential risk. I want to talk a little bit about how journalism itself works. There are 5 W's of reporting. The 5 questions we're all meant to answer, when we really try to report out and write a story. That's who, what, where, and why. But the problem is that that doesn't really work for existential risk. We can't really say certainly when these will happen. We can't say where. We don't really know who will be responsible. We don't know for sure who will do it. And if we can't answer those other 4 questions, we can't really know why or how. That really makes it challenging for us to get our hands around it as a subject. It also tends to be obviously highly technical. Most of the media isn't fluent in these topics, especially ones that are more complex, like artificial general intelligence. There are few identifiable culprits or victims. Most of those people, of course, are in the future. We in the media and the public more generally have a hard time looking at the further future, for that matter, just a few years in advance, and it's hard to verify them. Again, I could have been writing a pandemic prevention cover story for Time magazine back in 2017, but there wasn't anything I could hang that on. It was something I was warning that would happen in the future. It wasn't something to be verified in the moment. And of course, in the moment is where we in the media really try to live. And I know you'll also probably worried a little bit about disinformation, misinformation. This is also a major issue around media. And I happen to notice, Elon Musk, of course, was talking about buying Twitter last week, actually, and he might still be in the process of doing it. He might have already done it so forth. I haven't checked Twitter recently. And he had a quote while he was giving an interview at the TED last week, where he said basically, something like this, that civilizational risk is decreased the more we can increase the trust in Twitter as a public platform. Now, I don't really think the future of civilization rests on whether Elon can actually scrounge up enough capital to turn Twitter private, but it's very true that dis and misinformation are real issues. It can make it harder to report truthfully. And even more so, it's really harder to ensure that truth reporting isn't drowned in an ocean of lies and errors. But there's a problem there too. I mean, disinformation, misinformation, this is not new to the media. It's not new to the public sphere. And what's new about it is really more a matter of tech-driven media disaggregation that simply isn't something that can be reversed. The internet has replaced what you might think of as an old broadcasting model of media, where whoever had the biggest microphone or literally the biggest printing press by definition got to speak the loudest, to something that's more like a choose your own story model. It's supported the creation of media that at its best is actually better, I think, more rigorous, more truthful than what existed before, but it also gives oxygen to anyone else who's capable of filling a void on the part of the audience. If the audience wants to find something for whatever reason, political reasons, cultural reasons, they will find someone out there who can tell it to them. And that makes it very hard to get rid of that disinformation, misinformation problem. And the media, it's important to remember, we have no real single claim on the truth. You don't need a professional license to report the news. You don't have peer review or a tenure board deciding who could be trusted and who can't. We really just have the trust of our audience. And ultimately that trust increasingly isn't there. I could show you a Pew poll report from 2021 that shows trust in US national and local news organizations over the last 5 years just continuing declining. Now that trust has become more politically polarized. We'll see more Republicans or conservative-leaning people in the US and many other countries, I suspect, who increasingly doubt the media. But really, it's something that's happening across both parties. And it takes a very sharp dip beginning with COVID-19, which is ironic, because that's the moment when trust in the media, as well as other large organizations like government and public health authorities, was at its most important. And that's when that trust really began to decline. So as much as we might hope that, in some ways we could clean up misinformation, that if the public is given correct information, they'll make the right decision about major threats, including existential risks, I just find that very unlikely in a democratic sphere. It's just very hard to actually make that happen. And climate change actually provides an interesting example here. It shows that just providing information through the media, even correct information, isn't enough on its own to change minds. This is something called the failure of the information deficit model of science communication. Basically, researchers like Dan Cahan at Yale have shown that, as much as women have hoped that, if you just allow the scientists to talk to people, give them the facts, that will change their minds, that has just proven time and time again not to be true. You can't really just provide the science, expect people to act on it. Really, what matters is where you're saying it, how they're receiving it. And those are things that, to a large extent, are somewhat outside, I think, the media's control. And I think if we didn't know that with climate change, we certainly have learned it with COVID-19. It's something where at that moment that just simply that it was a clear clear danger to the present. It was something, it wasn't a future threat. It was something happening to us in the moment. And the media actually reported as such. I think if you look at media coverage about COVID overall, if you look at more mainstream, more legitimate sources, often you'll find them echoing what public health authorities and the government might say. They're not really putting out falsehoods, not putting out misinformation. And yet, certainly in the United States and many other countries as well, I think, you saw hesitation towards vaccinations. You saw, frankly, crazy, controversial ideas. You saw people doubting the danger of this threat itself. And if you can't get the public to really, through the media, accept that a threat happening to them in the moment is real, that requires action, it's that much more difficult, I think, really, to try to get them to prepare for something that might be out there in the future. So that's something, just to bring it and keep it on the subject of pandemics, I can look at both the present threat of pandemics, but also the future one, the ones we really have to worry about, both natural and potentially human-made. And we actually do know, and the media has reported sometimes, what we need to do to minimize the chances of a devastating future pandemic. I'll be showing you right now, there's a bipartisan commission on biodefense here in the US. It's a blue ribbon panel of former politicians and experts who've been urging the US government to spend a lot now to prevent pandemics in the future. They actually just released a report called the Athena Agenda. It calls for a doubling down on what worked with COVID, really investing heavily in pre-trials of vaccines, antivirals, to get the time needed to bring out new treatments should a virus emerge. It means spending to boost supplies of PPE, investing in better models. It means cracking down on lab security to reduce the chance of accidents and leaks. It means far better oversight of bioengineering and DNA synthesis to prevent dangerous viruses from being created in the lab, whether for benign or malign purposes. This kind of plan, it won't be easy, it won't be cheap. It's about $100 billion over 10 years to the US, but at the same time, given the fact that the pandemic has already killed millions and led to trillions of dollars in economic damage, it's hard to believe that investment wouldn't be more than worth it. And much more than known but difficult risks like climate change, or really difficult to calculate ones like AGI, with pandemics, we know the steps to take, and we can take them, I think, without much dislocation or difficulty, certainly compared to those other two threats. And yet, funding for truly effective pandemic prevention has been almost non-existent, certainly in the United States. Congress has failed to really allocate more money. The Biden administration has tried, has largely failed. This has not been a major priority for that. And so this failure, it's largely at the same time been ignored or underplayed by the media, with a few exceptions. I mean, we at Vox Future Perfect, we've covered this quite closely. We reported on this Athena Agenda report recently. And, we actually even devoted a special week of coverage on the Future Perfect site just a few weeks ago to the upgrades we need to do to better handle the next pandemic. And I'm very proud of that coverage, but the truth is it hasn't done a whole lot to move the needle with either politicians or the public. Now, let me use an example here of something that's different. Now, on Monday, around the time I would have been flying over to the UK, but for my own obvious positive COVID test, a federal judge blocked the CDC from renewing its rule on mask wearing on domestic flights in the US. This is something that created a cacophony of coverage and commentary. You had Americans on either side of it. One, side might be incredibly glad this is happening. Others felt, we're essentially making this pandemic worse. We're putting people at risk. That is the kind of thing that the media actually can cover. We know how to cover that sort of two sides of a controversy. We know how to cover that kind of conflict. And it's personally frustrating to me that I see all the energy that's being devoted to that question, which, is important, but ultimately far less important than whether we're going to make the investments we need to do to head off a future pandemic. That's something that should be getting people excited. That's something that should be, politicians should be really have their feet held to the fire on. And yet it's not something you read about much, And the reason here is that emotional conflict, really political and cultural conflict, is key to how the media does its work. Stories depend on some degree of conflict. Without it, and I tell this to all the reporters who work below me, you don't really have a story, you just have a topic. So, even though that travel mask mandate may not be that important, you have intense emotional engagement around the topic. Emotional engagement is the lifeblood of conflict, and conflict is really the lifeblood of a story. And that's, again, to go back to climate change, that's part of the reason why climate change, unlike other future-focused existential risks, has really generated much more reliable coverage, because that conflict is built into the subject itself. Climate change has clearly identifiable heroes as activists, as scientists, as friendly politicians, as villains, as energy companies, climate deniers, politicians on their side. It has clear battlegrounds where this conflict takes place, the UN climate conferences and elections and so forth. And it has, at least temporarily, it has clearly identifiable winners and losers. You can see progress forward, you can see progress backwards. That's something that's much more easy, I think, for the media to cover. And we've actually seen that increase. There was a study out of the University of Colorado in December that found that climate coverage in the US media had reached an all-time high in October and November 2021. That was about coinciding with the UN climate conference in Glasgow. Big mainstream media organizations like the New York Times and the BBC have boosted their coverage of climate change. They're hiring more reporters. They're launching new products. At the same time, how much of an impact that's actually made on changing the response to climate change is somewhat of a different story. And it didn't escape my notice personally that for all this attention, for all this reporting, even the Democratic administration, the White House, once gas prices, petrol prices started rising in the US because of the war in Ukraine, suddenly they started looking, where can I start drilling for more oil? But what you can say is the media is not covering this subject, and I think covering it pretty comprehensively. But the same is not really true for other catastrophic and existential risks. And that's in part because we have no frame of reference for, say, extremely rare natural threats, beyond disaster films in the 1990s like Deep Impact and Armageddon. Asteroid supervolcanoes, they make for very poor antagonists. They're hard to identify with. Something like artificial general intelligence is a highly technical threat. That makes it difficult to cover, makes it even harder to really discover a solution. It's entirely devoid of that conflict that really feeds media coverage. It's dependent on advances that may or may not happen. I personally cover these kind of risks for a living, and I struggle to find out or to figure out how should I be dealing with that particular threat of AGI. Now, we have no real excuse, of course, for failing to direct that kind of coverage toward pandemic prevention, but here, again, we're hampered by the lack of conflict. There's no real sides on this. There's really no sides that are saying, all right, we must do more on pandemics. Oh, no, we must not. It's just kind of out there, something people know they should deal with. It doesn't really drive coverage in that way. And there's no enemies to identify beyond a virus that might exist one day. And that brings me back to a point here, which is the future is one of the hardest things in the world to report on. Now, I've outlined some of the challenges the media faces in reporting accurately on catastrophic and existential risks, but to ask ourselves, what can actually be done about this problem? And I want to tell a little bit about the story about the place where I work right now, Vox's Future Perfect, because I think it tells the story of some of these challenges and provides one way we in the media can try to respond to them by changing what we do and changing actually how we produce and how we fund media as well. Here's that. So back in 2013, my now colleague at Vox, Dylan Matthews, was working at the Washington Post. He was covering politics. And he tells a story. He was writing a short article, I believe it was about why the Senate Majority Leader at the time was voting against his own cloture motion. You don't have to know what cloture is. I honestly don't really know what cloture is either, or why Senator Reid was doing what he was doing. It apparently had something to do with approving the nomination of the Defense Secretary at the time. But it was the kind of procedural story that political reporters will spend many of their hours in their career filing. It feels important in the moment, but ultimately it's just one story among thousands, one that would really have very little importance beyond that day. And that's how many of us in the media, even the serious media, legitimate media, the mainstream media, spend much of our time. We're writing about things that seem to matter, but don't in any really lasting way. And then we move on to the next story and the next one and the next one. And I want to side note here. I mean, one thing I've always noticed about the media was that, we may have digital media now might be dominant. We're used to getting things on the feed that seems infinite, but we still have newspapers, we still have TV news. And I've often sat and wondered, why is it day after day, the newspaper is around the same length? The 30-minute TV news program is always 30 minutes. That's not because, the world produces exactly the right amount of news every day to fit into those slots. It might be because we have advertising to sell or subscribers to satisfy. And so we have to produce that product, whether or not there are enough significant events to happen to actually fill legitimately that space, that airtime. That's just the way we've always done it. And I think we know somewhere in the back of our heads, that's the case, that what we produce is ephemeral, often insignificant, but we do it because that's the job, and we do it because that's the way we've always done. It's publish or perish. It's not just for academia, it's also for those of us in the working press. But to go back to the origins of Vox Future Perfect, Dylan, he thinks differently. And as he was writing up that article, he was seized by a thought. Why does this even matter? And instead of putting aside that thought, which is the way most of us would do, Dylan persisted. He posed the question to his then editor at the Post, a writer named Ezra Klein. Ezra, you might know his work in launching Vox. He's now a columnist in the New York Times. He thinks differently as well. He didn't respond the way to that question a lot of editors might have, the editors I've worked with at least, which is essentially, it matters because I told you to do it, and also, where's your story? He said, if we only write about the stuff that's really, really important, we write about nothing but malaria. Years later, after they both moved on from the Post to launch Vox.com, that conversation helped give birth to Future Perfect in 2018. Now, Future Perfect is a vertical which is digital media speak for a dedicated section within a website, and it's focused on writing about stories that truly matter for the long-term future of humanity. So that means infectious diseases like malaria that continue to kill hundreds of thousands of people a year. It means covering catastrophes that feel so common we've stopped looking at them, like the scourge of global poverty, and writing about far-sighted ideas that can help change that future, like effective altruism. It means covering undercovered moral issues, like the suffering and welfare of billions of farm animals. And it absolutely means covering pandemic prevention. As I said before, we had a week-long pandemic-proof series, which covered advanced vaccine trials, ways to safeguard the engineering of future viruses, ways to mass produce better PPE. It was 8, 9, 10 stories we did over the course of a week, all about not preparing for this pandemic, but preparing for the next one. And it means understanding and covering again and again the catastrophic existential risks that, in Dylan's words, could end humankind altogether, prevent trillions or quadrillions of humans from enjoying happy lives in the future. And this is something I've written about myself, both about nuclear war more recently with the war in Ukraine, other issues too. And that's really why I personally came to Future Perfect late last year. This has been a subject I was passionate about my entire career, but had never really found a place where I could put those lessons, that interest, that passion into being. When this opening of Future Perfect opened up, I knew this is the place I wanted to be. I wanted to run this team, try to create a different kind of media that would really matter for the long term of humanity. And so with help from philanthropic funders, we had the luxury of covering what's absolutely necessary for the future of the world. Dylan is someone who can write about inflation, the Fed, make it undeniably compelling. We have Segal Samuels, who can write about the risks and benefits of AI, the hard ethical questions that will define our future. Kelsey Piper, whom we recruited from the effective altruism community, is our liaison to that world, and increasingly our point person on biosecurity and the criminally undercovered risk of human-made pandemics. Another writer, Kenny Torella, came to us from the world of animal welfare advocacy. He brings a moral rigor to one of the most important questions we'll face in the future, the fate of billions of animals with whom we share the planet. But we also aim to go beyond simply writing about the problems of future and existential risks, as well as some of the possible solutions. We want to produce a media that is capable of going beyond built-in habits and covering those questions. We need journalists versed in those subjects. So to that end, last year, we welcomed our first class of Future Perfect reporting fellows. There are 3 writers, all of whom come from outside the traditional confines of journalism, who will spend the year with us reporting and writing stories of Future Perfect, but just as importantly, learning the habits of mind needed to cover existential risk and beyond. We expect this to be an ongoing mission on our part at Future Perfect. We want to equip tomorrow's journalists, send them out into the world so they can ask not just what happened, but what really matters. And increasingly, we have competition on this existential risk beat, which is actually a good thing. I mentioned Ezra Klein. He is now over at the New York Times. He peppers his brilliant columns and podcast conversations with references to catastrophic risk prevention, effective altruism, how the government can shape material and ethical progress for a better future. The Times also started something called the Headway Initiative, which produces deeply reported, data-rich projects that aim to tackle the issues that matter beyond the 24-hour news cycle. There's writer Derek Thompson at the Atlantic magazine, who's carved out a niche covering questions of progress and technological change. You have, of course, the venerable Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist, which you probably best know for the annual Doomsday Clock, meant to track just how close humanity is to extinction. They do very strong work covering existential risks of all kinds. Here in the UK, you have BBC's excellent Future Vertical, great writers like Richard Fisher, who produce thought-provoking stories about the questions that will define the decades to come. And, philanthropists who care about existential risk are increasingly a part of this ecosystem. They're funding media outlets and projects that reflect those concerns. I was very pleased to see that one of the first donations made by the FTX Future Fund, which is backed by the cryptocurrency billionaire and effective altruism advocate Sam Bankman-Fried, went to a nonprofit journalism outfit called ProPublica to fund coverage on ongoing questions about biosecurity. That $5 million to go to a team of editors and reporters who will look at the security of labs doing cutting-edge biological research and really the state of monitoring systems that are meant to catch new infectious diseases as they emerge. This is the kind of funding that we need to support the kind of journalism that stands a chance at actually helping prevent the existential risk we'll be spending these days discussing. And I'd love to see more of that for other risks, for non-aligned AI, for preventing nuclear war, for planetary defense, for anticipating other technological threats, and more. This is an area, I think, where commercial media will struggle because there will not always be a reliable audience. It's not an easy way to sell advertising, really, against the end of the world. But as long as there are dedicated philanthropic funders who care about those issues, I think, and this is obviously somewhat self-interested, but I do think there are worthy recipients for that money in the media world to build out the outlets, to build out the expertise, to build out the habits of mind needed to produce members of the media who can actually understand these issues, report them effectively, and ever so slowly build the audience for that. And outside traditional media, you have the growth of newsletters on platforms like Substack. It's giving the opportunity for really smart commentators, both from the journalistic world, from the academic world, from sometimes in between, who can reach writers directly about subjects like pandemic prevention. And they can focus on why they matter and what we can do about them. These are often subscription-driven platforms. That helps as well. You might have a smaller audience, but you have a more dedicated audience. And this can be especially useful for moving elite opinion, which I think particularly matters here. I imagine a lot of you are familiar with Robert Willebin's 80,000 Hours site and podcast, which produces really in-depth conversation with experts, existential risk and effective altruism, and it goes far deeper than conventional media often could, and it gives smart and interested young people a platform developing their own careers in this subject matter. It's really a platform that can help train the next generation of existential risk scholars, of people who might go into government or business, caring about these subjects. That really is the way I think you can help affect change over the long term. So really, from Future Perfect on down, there's never been more media coverage raising the salience of existential risk than connected subjects. There's never been a better time to be engaged and working in these subjects as the journalists. So for those who want it, there's a wealth of brilliance in the field, and I expect that to only grow in the future. It's still a small part of media overall, I think, for the reasons I noted. It's something where it's difficult, I think, for the broader media sphere to write about this every day. That's probably beyond what they can do. But through the creation, through the support of these more specialized groups, I think that can actually make a difference. Now, just in conclusion, I think, go back, the reason why the media as a whole is ill-equipped to cover a lot of these risks is the same reason that we as a species struggle to understand and prepare for them. We are psychologically biased to focus on the here and now at the expense of the unknown. Our attention is consumed by conflicts in the present, whether or not they're actually important, and too often we ignore the future. We have that media because we are the people that we are, and we can't change that any more than we can change our own reflection. And if we're dissatisfied with that, it's because we're dissatisfied by ourselves. But just as the existential risk community has represented this conference, has helped raise the profile of the dire threats to humanity's future, better and more comprehensive reporting can help nudge that needle of public attention and political attention on these risks, at least a little bit. And that coverage is improving. It's slow, but it's improving. And however outweighed it might be by the risk of disinformation and misinformation in that constant war for public attention, because that's what we're really talking about here. This is a war for attention, really for numbers, for mindshare, I suppose, and we have to actually be fighting that. And that's, I think, where we get to the funding those kind of outlets can really do that. And I'll just end by telling a story from very early in my career. A long time ago, when I was a student in university, I spent a summer interning at a trade magazine that covered the business of media. And we wrote about TV ratings or about circulation numbers. That's what things we did. Early on during my internship there, the magazine's editor asked me to define what I thought media existed for. Now, I can't remember what I said. It was probably something at journalism school about the search for truth, for fighting for the public good, comforting the afflicted, et cetera, et cetera. But I remember very clear what he told me next. He said, media is about putting eyeballs in front of advertisers. I thought that was a cynical response, and I think it was. There's also an element of truth to that. We are in the business of finding those eyeballs, directing them to what we produce. The question for us, the question for the role that the media can play in safeguarding humanity's future is, what will we drive them to? And I really hope that in the work of Vox, the work of Future Perfect, the work of others in this field can help change that, can help drive attention toward the subjects that really matter, towards the things that will make a difference, not just for the present, but for the future and the far future beyond that. Thank you very much. I'm sorry about the slides again. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Bryan, and additional thanks for doing that without the diagrams. It looks a bit like a blackboard, and I was tempted to try and draw a version of your graphs on here, but I think we definitely got the gist. You did an incredible job.
No problem.
There. I'm just going to go to a couple of questions from Discord, aware that we've only got about 10 minutes, and then I'll take some more from the room. So Pablo Suarez, who's in Boston, was helping us with some creative communications within this team yesterday in some icebreakers. He asked, what concrete advice for us as existential risk scholars and practitioners do you have to help the media be ready to act appropriately if or when a specific threat becomes much more likely? So can we work with your sector to plan for actual interventions with the media as a partner? Can we become partners in preparedness and planning, really, as well as in the new forms of the editorial meeting that you've been inventing?
Oh, absolutely. I think you can. I think it's important to bring the media as much as possible into these kind of gatherings, into these kind of organizations, and that's sort of how you build rapport over time. That's how you build familiarity with the subject matter, familiarity with reporters themselves. I saw that over my career with climate change. I spent actually a number of years focusing on climate change. And back in the mid 2000s, when I was first doing it, it was not exactly a niche subject, but its kind of interest would kind of rise and fall based off whatever was happening in the world. But over time, it really became something that more and more reporters became familiar with. It went beyond just the specialists, the environmental reporters, to almost everyone. Everyone knew that this was a subject they had to know about, they had to care about, they had to be able to write about. So, over the long term, I think through bringing those reporters into these kind of meetings, frankly, to talking about them, to being very patient, because again, we're talking about a very technical subject. There's not always going to be that background level of knowledge. You can help enlist the media in these kind of events. And then when you have something like, obviously, a pandemic would be a great example, but let's imagine, anything that could happen when we need to understand what should we be doing about AGI. If you have built that background rapport, you've built that background knowledge in the part of the media that you're working with, they can play a role. They can't be controlled, but just building that out, I think building it on an educational level, that's what we're trying to do with the Future Perfect Reporting Fellows. We want to create a situation where they know about how this works, and then they go out into the world, maybe they go out elsewhere in the media, and even if they're doing something that has nothing to do with these subjects, they're used to that. They know the terms, they know why it's important. Over enough time, I'm hoping that will spread out to all kinds of existential risk subjects, and you'll see not just specialist journalists like myself, but really all kinds of journalists who will at least know what we're talking about, know why it matters, and then be able to respond to it, if and when an event does happen.
Thank you. And I'm just going to go a quick question from Matthew Rendell, who's he asked if the narrative that there's even 100% probability over some very long time spans of things like asteroids or nuclear war, some would argue, I might add. And so does the narrative, if we don't do X and Y, Y will eventually happen, does that help with some of those editors that you described earlier who are stubborn to other reasons for talking about these risks?
That's where you get to the long time frame. That's a real challenge here. You're absolutely right. Over a long enough time frame, certainly something like an asteroid strike will happen, but probably then you're getting beyond any kind of human time frame. Something like nuclear war, I think that's a better point. I absolutely agree that if these weapons are in play for a long enough time, something will happen, and potentially in the shorter term than the longer term. That is the biggest obstacle, I think, in many ways to overcome, not just for the media, I think, but for the public more generally. We're not used to thinking about those long-term timescales. Many of us won't be around if and when these kind of events happen. But I think that's a decent argument to make. That has to be paired, though, with what can actually be done about it. And that's why, subjects like pandemic prevention, that's why I came back to that again and again, in part because it's something I've covered my entire career, but also because it's one where it is both clear and present. It's happening right now. We know it will get worse. We know that the threat from natural pandemics perhaps is static, perhaps is rising over time. Certainly the risk, I think, from bioengineered pandemics, whether on purpose or accidentally, will only grow in the future. That's something where, all right, we can tackle specific things that can be done about it. We can understand it better, and you can have media reporting on it. I mean, that's why I was particularly really glad to see that ProPublica grant I mentioned from Sam Bankman-Friedman and the FTX Future Fund. That's a subject, biosecurity, that is criminally undercovered in the media today. And you really do need to help fund those groups that have the interest to go very deep into it, to do hard investigative work, because it's not easy to really report on something like lab safety, for instance. So I would say, that argument can help. It's just that it helps if you can make that time cycle as short as possible. And that's probably why we will have a little bit more luck with something like pandemics or even climate change to a certain extent than those further off risks that are harder to grasp, like AGI.
Thank you. So Shahar, I think we'll go to a question in the room. We'll come to Ellie a second, but I wanted to go to Tom, one of our colleagues, who has been, if you're wondering what I'm doing here, he's kindly making the Discord questions into short form so I can actually read them out for most of this conference, and has finally one of his own questions, which I think he deserves at the end of day 2.
I don't think I can handle the pressure now. So Bryan, thank you. That was really interesting. And you've actually semi-answered or talked around some of what I wanted to ask you anyway, but I'm interested in hearing more about what you think about the kind of either agenda setting or kind of policy impact role that some of the work that you and others do as journalists. And for context to that, I think in the big recent case study we've had of a massive risk, the pandemic, it seemed really clear to see some journalistic figures, for better or worse, have a really strong shaping impact on what policy actors were saying, on what populations thought, on like an evolving common sense. So I guess, what do you think about that? And if you think that that's a real thing that kind of exists, if there's that substantive role as well as just reportage role, like what does that mean for thinking about your practice or the practice of your profession?
That's absolutely true. And I think agenda setting is an increasingly important part of what certain parts of the media do. That's really what we try to do at Vox Future Perfect. And we're interested in reaching as wide an audience as possible, but we in some ways measure our success by have we moved the needle on actual agenda setting? If we hear back that, okay, a story we did, maybe more likely that one senator, one representative would vote for, say, that biodefense program I mentioned, that matters. Or you're introducing new ideas like EA, which is still fairly new to most of the public, into that public sphere. You're hoping that actually does make a difference. So, in some ways, this is an evolution of what I would have thought of as the sort of conventional idea of me before, which was, again, those 5 Ws, very straight facts. The reality is, I think that you can make a difference in agenda setting. Certain journalists we can do that. We see that again with the disaggregation of the internet. This has given an opportunity for individual journalists to reach audiences on their own. It's in some ways weakened the strength of a lot of conventional brands, because suddenly their reporters, their writers can have their own audiences. I mentioned the growth of platforms like Substack that also enables people to reach audiences on their own. And increasingly, this is not just straight reporting, but it is interpretation. That's a lot of what we do. The world gets ever more complicated. We're trying to interpret it in a certain kind of way. And so, yes, I think you can do that. At the same time, you have to understand that that's a great responsibility. If you're actually going to do that kind of work, if you're going to go beyond that kind of traditional reporting, you have to be sure about what you're doing. You have to understand the responsibility you have. This is not just a matter of getting facts right or wrong, but you actually be playing some role in moving the public discussion, moving political action in one way or another. I expect that to continue in the future. I expect it, again, become more disaggregated, more about individual stars, individual voices versus potentially really big brands. But that will be the case, and that will only grow as that technological reach increases.
So the last question I'll give to Elias. I love putting pressure on people today. And just to say, to add to that very, very briefly, there's a US scholar in internet studies and regulation called Reneda Restra, and she talks about the right to free speech, but not the right to free reach. And then I think with this kind of very editorial form of journalism, that platform that they have, remembering to respect that reach that they have, and continue to remember they're just someone with the right to free speech, and that not all of their ideas deserve that level of profile. Anyway, Elias, last question.
What an honor to have the last question.
Thank you.
My question is, what might be good reasons for why the editors that you have experienced so far behave the way they do? So the background of this question is, it seems like the model right now is bypass the way the game currently works by funding outlets that cover this, like the work that you're doing or all the others that you've mentioned. I'm wondering, is there anything we can do about changing the game, quote unquote, or the system itself, so that also broader outlets like Times and New York Times, etc., become interested in this? Because otherwise I'm kind of concerned about ever-increasing fragmentation, also with Substack, etc. Yeah, that's the question.
No, I absolutely think that can happen. I think that's important because the same time as I've mentioned that disaggregation, that has also had the effect of strengthening certain really big brands. You mentioned the New York Times, and that's probably a much bigger brand with much bigger reach than it had 30 years ago before the internet really began to change things. In terms of how you shift that, well, I mean, I'm seeing some evidence of that. You know, I mentioned, you know, one thing that the New York Times is doing is something called the Headway Initiative, which is kind of a broad reporting project that draws on data to really explain the state of the world and where the world's going. It's kind of it's focused on progress perhaps, but like existential risk is part of progress. Obviously, you're not going to have progress if the world comes to an end. So in the same way that climate change went from somewhat of a niche specialist subject within the mainstream media to something that now is much more broadly covered, and not just among environmental reporters, but among business reporters, among political reporters, I think you could over time see the same thing with some aspects of existential risk. I would really hope that's the case with pandemic prevention. It'd be shocking after all this if it doesn't. But you know, over time that could happen with other things. In the same way that existential risk itself was once a my understanding, fairly niche academic subject. I think who was it? Nick Bostrom said, you know, more studies about ice cream or something like that than there were about the end of the world. That's obviously not so much the case anymore. I think over time you'll see that reflected in the media as well. How you do that, I mean, it's hard. You know, some of that is generational change. I think the way it actually works in academia as well. I expect that the next generation of writers and reporters who go into these places will be coming in with different perspectives on these subjects. Again, something similar with the climate change. And that's why, you know, I think it's really important to train those journalists. You know, so going into journalism schools or the programs we do with our fellows, that's not just about strengthening us as a brand, you know, Future Perfect. It's about seeding the ground for the future for a new crop of journalists who understand these subjects, who understand their importance, and will bring that to bear in their reporting, even if they're doing something that has, on the surface, very little to do with these subjects.
Thank you, Bryan. And one last round of applause for Bryan. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.